Hey guys, tonight we begin with something darker, a time when your wedding night wasn't private, when church officials counted witnesses, when your most intimate moments became legal testimony. We're diving into medieval sexuality, the parts they skip in history class, the invasions nobody warns you about, the truth about what happened when 23 strangers surrounded your marriage bed. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you just got married. The ceremony was beautiful. The feast lasted 12 hours. You're wearing a gown heavy with jewels that's been crushing your ribs since dawn. Your new husband, a man you met twice before today, stands beside you looking equally terrified. Now comes the part nobody fully explained. The Archbishop enters your bedchamber. Behind him, 23 men file in. Nobles, courtiers, church officials. They're taking positions around your bed. They're not leaving. You're 15 years old. It's 1445. You're Margaret of Anjou, and you just married the King of England. This marriage seals an alliance between England and France worth more than your weight in gold. Treaties depend on it. Armies wait on it. Kingdoms balance on what happens in this room tonight. So the witnesses stay, positioned around the bed, listening through thin curtains, waiting for sounds that confirm the union is complete. Your hands are shaking. Your husband looks pale. Neither of you has done this before. And just beyond those curtains, the most powerful men in England are waiting to hear whether their king can perform. This isn't some bizarre royal custom. This is standard procedure across medieval Europe. This is marriage. This is normal. This is your wedding night. And it's about to get so much worse. Let's walk through what happens next, step by excruciating step. The feast finally ends. Midnight, sometimes later. The guests are drunk on ale and mead. The music starts. Drums and horns. Not celebration. Announcement. The procession to the bedchamber begins. You're walking through corridors lined with wedding guests who throw things at you. Grain for fertility. Flowers if you're lucky. Usually just whatever's handy. Someone's drunk uncle throws a chicken bone. It hits your shoulder. Everyone laughs. At the bedchamber door, the undressing begins. Your mother enters. Your aunts, your older sisters, every female relative you have. They start removing your wedding gown, layer by layer. Heavy brocade, silk underdress, linen shift. They're not gentle, they're efficient. This isn't about modesty or comfort. This is procedure. They touch your body, adjust your hair, whisper advice about what's coming. Your mother's voice is clinical. Your aunt is crude. Your cousin giggles. All of it spoken while a dozen other women watch. You're standing there in your undergarments, surrounded by relatives, while a priest blesses the marriage bed itself. He sprinkles holy water on the sheets, on the bedposts. He recites prayers for fertility, prayers that you'll conceive quickly, prayers that your husband will be capable and strong. Your husband is getting the same treatment in an adjacent room. His father, uncles, brothers, all of them stripping away his formal attire while making jokes. Some gentle, most crude, slapping his back, testing his nerve. Then you're both led to the bed. The curtains are drawn, thin fabric that blocks sight but not sound. The witnesses take their positions, some near the bedposts, some by the door, all of them waiting. Think about that pressure for a moment. You're young, 14, 15, 16 if you're lucky. It's your first time with this person. Possibly your first time ever. Your body is nervous. Your mind is racing. You have no idea what you're supposed to do. And just beyond that thin curtain, your parents are listening. Your uncle is listening. The local bishop is listening. All of them judging whether you're succeeding, whether this marriage is real, whether the alliance holds. The marriage has to be consummated tonight. Has to. The witnesses need proof they can testify to in court if this marriage is ever challenged. Your heartbeat is so loud, you're sure they can hear it. Your husband's hands are trembling. The bed creaks. Someone outside coughs. This is your wedding night. Welcome to medieval marriage. But here's what nobody mentions about the witnesses. What they're actually listening for isn't just sounds. They're timing you. You survived the night, somehow. You didn't sleep. How could you? Even after the witnesses finally left, you lay there in the dark, knowing that morning would bring fresh humiliations. Dawn breaks. You hear footsteps. Servants enter the bedchamber without knocking. They don't ask permission. They don't avert their eyes. They walk straight to your bed and pull back the sheets while you're still in it. They're looking for blood, proof of your virginity and successful consummation. You watch their faces as they inspect the fabric, searching for red stains, examining the pattern and placement, making notes. If there's blood, congratulations. Your marriage stands, your reputation holds, the alliance is secure. If there's blood, those sheets get displayed publicly, hung from castle windows, paraded through the household for family and guests to see. Your blood, your pain, your most private moments, now public evidence. But what if there's no blood? What if you were too scared, too tense? What if your body didn't cooperate? What if the mechanics simply didn't work the way everyone expected? The questions begin immediately. Your mother enters with two older women you've never met. Midwives, appointed by your family. They need to examine you. They tell you to lie back, spread your legs. They probe, cold hands, no gentleness, no privacy. They're checking whether you're still intact, whether your husband failed, whether you lied about your virginity. Their findings get reported to both families, written down, discussed at length. Your body becomes evidence, your anatomy becomes legal testimony. If the marriage appears unconsummated, attention turns to your husband. Can he perform? Is he capable? The whispers start immediately. They spread through the household, through the court, through every social circle he belongs to. In extreme cases, he faces formal examination to prove he's physically capable of completing marital duties. Yes, you read that right. Let me tell you exactly what that means. Picture this. You're a man in medieval Europe. Your wife, or maybe her family, claims you can't consummate the marriage. She wants an annulment. She says you're incapable. You deny it. You insist you're perfectly fine, that she's lying, that she's trying to escape the marriage for other reasons. The church court has to determine who's telling the truth. They appoint a panel, 3 university-trained physicians, 3 honest matrons, older women with reputations for virtue and experience in such matters. Together, they're going to assess your capability. Personally, you're brought to a private chamber in the courthouse. The panel explains what's required. You need to demonstrate your physical capability while they wait in an adjoining room. The physicians examine you first, checking for obvious physical defects or conditions that would prevent consummation. Malformation, injury, disease. They document their findings in Latin. The court scribe records everything. Then you're left alone in the chamber, with instructions: achieve erection, produce emission, prove you can do what a husband must do. The pressure is crushing. You're not aroused, you're terrified. Your entire future depends on whether your body cooperates under the most humiliating circumstances imaginable. Failure means your marriage gets annulled, your reputation destroyed, your manhood publicly questioned for the rest of your life. After a period of time, how long? 10 minutes? 20? Forever? The panel enters the room. They examine you. They look for physical evidence. They question you about what occurred. They document everything for the court in language that's clinical, but explicit. This isn't fiction. This isn't exaggeration. Court records survive. Ecclesiastical archives from York, England, contain detailed documentation of these examinations. Names, dates, explicit testimony from the physicians and matrons about what they observed. In 1433, a woman named Agnes sought annulment from her husband John. She testified that after 3 years of marriage, he'd never successfully consummated their union. She argued he was physically incapable. John appeared before the court and denied everything. The court ordered examination. The panel reported that John had successfully demonstrated capability. They'd observed physical evidence supporting his claims. In their medical opinion, he was fully capable of consummating marriage. Agnes's petition was denied. She remained married to John, whether she wanted to or not. Now imagine being John. Imagine performing sexually under those circumstances. Knowing that failure means humiliation, but also knowing that your actual lived experience with Agnes for 3 years told a different story than what you managed to produce in a courthouse chamber with strangers waiting. Or imagine being Agnes, stuck in a marriage that clearly wasn't working. Watching your only escape route blocked because your husband managed to perform once for a panel of examiners, regardless of what your actual experience had been for 3 years. And this happened regularly. Dozens of documented cases across medieval Europe. Some men failed the examination. Multiple attempts, multiple failures, documented in permanent public record. In 1292, a Frenchman named Walter failed 3 separate examinations over the course of a month. Each time, despite physicians providing herbal stimulants that were supposed to help, he couldn't demonstrate capability. His marriage was annulled. His wife was declared free to remarry. Walter's failure became part of permanent public record. His most private inadequacy documented in church archives. His name is still there, Walter, who couldn't perform. Forever. Some men took desperate measures rather than face this humiliation. Spanish fly, cantharides, an extreme irritant that causes inflammation and swelling in the genital area. Mimics arousal, also highly toxic, can cause permanent damage, can kill you. Medieval medical texts warned about the dangers: burning pain, bloody urine, kidney failure, agonizing death. Men used it anyway, because the alternative, public acknowledgement of sexual failure, seemed worse than poisoning themselves. Women faced different but equally invasive examinations. If a husband claimed his wife was physically incapable of consummation, that her anatomy was malformed or blocked, she'd be examined by midwives appointed by the court. Internal examination, invasive probing, assessment of whether she was open and capable or closed and impossible. Their findings reported to the court in detail. Permanent legal record. Everyone would know. Everyone would remember. Your body wasn't yours. Your marriage wasn't private. Your most intimate capabilities became legal evidence, documented by strangers, discussed in courts, remembered forever. And we're just getting started. Because once you survived the wedding night, once you passed the examinations, once your marriage was confirmed, then came the rules about when you were actually allowed to touch your spouse. So you made it through the witnessed wedding night. You survived the morning inspection. Your marriage is legally valid. Surely now the church steps back and leaves you alone with your spouse? Wrong. So incredibly wrong. The medieval Catholic Church had detailed specific, unbending rules about when you could be intimate with your spouse, how you could do it, what positions were acceptable, and what you could think about during it. These weren't gentle suggestions. These were laws backed by the threat of eternal damnation, enforced through mandatory confession, punishable by public penance that would shame you in front of your entire community. Let's start with when you were allowed. No sex on Sundays. That's the Lord's Day, meant for worship and rest, not physical pleasure. Having relations on Sunday was desecrating the day Christ rose from the dead. Also forbidden, Wednesdays and Fridays throughout the year. Traditional fast days, days of abstinence and self-denial. Sex on fast days was incompatible with the penitential spirit. During Lent, 40 days before Easter, all marital relations completely forbidden. Most important penitential season of the year. Married couples expected to live like monks and nuns, abstain entirely, same during Advent, 4 weeks before Christmas, season of preparation, sexual abstinence required. For 3 days before taking communion, which serious Christians did monthly at minimum, required at Easter, couples had to abstain. You needed spiritual purification. Marital relations made you ritually impure. During menstruation, relations strictly forbidden. Medieval people believed menstrual blood was toxic and polluting. The Book of Leviticus condemned it. Medieval theology emphasized that such acts would produce deformed or demon-possessed children. During pregnancy, once visibly showing, relations discouraged and often explicitly forbidden. The logic, intimacy serves no purpose since conception already occurred. Continuing was purely lustful. After childbirth, women went through churching ceremony, ritual purification, before returning to normal life, typically 40 days after birth. 40 days mandatory abstinence following every pregnancy. Medieval historians have calculated the cumulative impact of all these restrictions. A devout medieval couple following every church rule strictly would be permitted marital relations approximately 40 to 50 days per year, out of 365. And even on those permitted days, the church had rules about how. The church taught that the only morally acceptable purpose for marital relations was procreation. St. Augustine established this principle in the 4th century. It remained absolute church doctrine throughout the medieval period. Any act that couldn't result in pregnancy was sinful. Any position or practice that seemed designed more for pleasure than procreation was problematic. The church approved essentially one position: man on top, woman on her back, face to face. Why this position specifically? Medieval physicians believed it was most conducive to conception. Woman lying on her back would receive the man's seed, which would flow naturally to her womb, aided by gravity. Any other position was suspect or outright condemned. Woman on top, that reversed the natural order of male dominance over female, reflected improper hierarchy. God established men above women. Position must reflect that. From behind, that's how animals coupled in fields. Humans were supposed to be above such base behavior. Any position that seemed animalistic was condemned as reducing humans to beasts. Standing, sitting, any creative variation, all problematic because they didn't optimize for procreation, suggested the couple was more interested in sensation than fulfilling God's command to multiply. Thomas Aquinas, most influential medieval theologian, wrote extensively about this in his Summa Theologica, created a careful hierarchy of sexual sins, ranking them by severity. According to Aquinas, any sexual act that wasted seed, meaning it couldn't possibly result in procreation, was a sin against nature itself. These sins against nature were worse than sins against persons. Read that again. Worse than sins against persons. In Aquinas' framework, self-pleasure was worse than forcing yourself on someone. Because forced relations could theoretically result in pregnancy, self-pleasure absolutely couldn't. The determining factor wasn't consent, wasn't harm to another person, was whether seed was being used for its divinely ordained purpose. Even oral contact or manual stimulation between married partners was condemned. Anything that didn't directly serve procreation was wasted effort and sinful indulgence. The church even regulated thoughts and emotions during marital relations. Lusting after your own spouse was problematic if your desire focused on physical pleasure rather than duty of procreation. You were supposed to approach marital intimacy with the same sober, dutiful attitude you'd bring to any unpleasant but necessary task. Some theologians argued that ideal Christian marriage would involve no physical pleasure at all. Couples should perform their procreative duty with all the enthusiasm of taking bitter medicine, necessary for health but never enjoyable. And here's where medieval life becomes truly invasive. You had to confess all of this, in detail, to your local priest. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 made annual confession mandatory for all Christians. Missing your yearly confession was itself a serious sin, could result in being barred from communion, even excommunicated. Priests used confession manuals called penitentials to guide their questioning. These books survive in monastery libraries across Europe. They list sins by category, provide appropriate penances for each, give priests specific questions to ask. The sections on marital sins are remarkably detailed and invasive. Confession manuals instructed priests to ask married couples, how often do you engage in relations with your spouse? On which days of the week? During which seasons? In which positions? For what purpose? Procreation or pleasure? Did either of you experience pleasure? Who initiated? Did you engage in any acts beyond basic union? Did you think lustful thoughts about your spouse or anyone else? Did you do anything to prevent conception? Your local priest, someone you saw at Mass every Sunday, who knew your family, who baptized your children, would ask these questions during confession, and you had to answer truthfully, or you'd be adding the sin of lying in confession to whatever else you'd done. The logic was theological and total. Marriage was instituted by God for procreation and as remedy against sin for those too weak for celibacy. Any use of marriage that strayed from these purposes was misuse, was sin, required confession and penance. Women faced an especially impossible situation within this system. The Church taught that wives must submit to their husbands in all things. Biblical doctrine from Paul's letters, preached from every pulpit. A wife who refused her husband's demands for relations was denying him his marital rights, which was itself a sin. But if a wife experienced pleasure during relations, that suggested she was lustful, carnal, controlled by base desires rather than reason. The ideal wife was supposed to endure marital duties without complaint, but also without enjoyment. Maintain spiritual detachment, even while her body participated. Submit when your husband demands, but don't want it. Participate in the act, but don't enjoy it. Then confess to your priest whether you felt pleasure, knowing that admitting pleasure marked you as spiritually weak and overly carnal. The story of Eve dominated how the Church understood female sexuality. Every sermon reminded women that Eve brought sin into the world. She listened to the serpent, ate the forbidden fruit, tempted Adam into disobedience. Woman was the gateway through which evil entered paradise. This meant female sexuality was viewed as inherently more dangerous than male sexuality. Women were naturally more lustful, more easily tempted, more likely to lead men into sin through their seductive nature. Therefore, women's bodies and desires had to be carefully controlled, constantly monitored, regularly confessed. And when you confessed these intimate details to your priest, he assigned penance. Sometimes private prayers, sometimes fasts, sometimes public penance that would reveal your sins to your entire community. If your sins were serious enough, you might be required to stand outside the church on Sundays in penitential garments while the congregation filed past you to Mass. Public display of your sexual sins. Everyone would see you, know what you'd done, judge you. You might have to make pilgrimages to distant shrines. You might face temporary excommunication, cut off from the sacraments that medieval people believed were necessary for salvation. Medieval married couples lived under constant spiritual surveillance, knowing their most private acts were subject to judgment, not just by God, but by their local priest who had authority to impose real-world punishments. Your intimate life wasn't between you and your spouse. It was between you, your spouse, the church, and God, with your local priest as judge, jury, and investigator. But here's where things get truly bizarre, because while the church was condemning pleasure and regulating every aspect of marital relations, medieval physicians were prescribing something completely different. Medieval medicine was based almost entirely on ancient Greek texts, particularly the writings of Galen, a physician from the 2nd century. His theories dominated medical education in every European university throughout the medieval period. Galen taught that the human body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant keeping these humours in proper balance. When medieval physicians applied humoral theory to reproduction, they arrived at conclusions that directly contradicted church teaching. Medieval medical texts taught what historians call the two-seed theory. According to this theory, conception required seed contributions from both male and female body. Man provided seed through emission, but woman also produced seed, female seed, that would mix with man's seed to create new life. Here's the detail that created massive contradiction with church doctrine. Medieval physicians believed women only released their seed during climax, during the peak of physical pleasure. This meant pregnancy was medically impossible without female satisfaction. According to medical theory taught in every university, if a wife didn't experience pleasure and reach climax, she couldn't conceive. Her seed wouldn't be released. No female seed meant no possibility of conception. This had enormous practical implications. Husbands who wanted children had a medical duty, not just kindness, but obligation to ensure their wives experienced satisfaction. Learning techniques to produce female pleasure wasn't optional indulgence. It was medical necessity for any couple hoping to have children. Medical texts like the Trotula included remarkably detailed advice on this subject. The Trotula circulated widely across Europe, copied in monastery scriptoriums, studied by university-trained physicians, referenced in medical consultations. It discussed the importance of gentle stimulation before proceeding with union, explained techniques for building female arousal gradually, recommended specific positions based on woman's humoral constitution, described herbal preparations that could enhance female sensitivity. It even listed the physical signs physicians should look for to determine whether a woman had reached climax. Medieval physicians understood, within their flawed framework, that women required different approaches than men, that patience was necessary, that rushing would be counterproductive, both for pleasure and for conception. Physicians prescribed various remedies to enhance female arousal. Oils infused with warming herbs like cinnamon, ginger, pepper, applied externally before relations. Tinctures containing mint and pennyroyal, consumed to increase sensitivity. Some recipes called for honey mixed with ground pepper, which sounds extraordinarily uncomfortable, but was believed to increase blood flow. Wealthy couples could consult physicians directly for advice on conception. These consultations weren't vague or euphemistic. They were explicit medical discussions about technique, positioning, timing, and female response. The physician would ask detailed questions. What had the couple tried? How did the wife respond? Did she show signs of reaching climax? Based on this information, the physician would prescribe specific approaches, different positions based on wife's humoral constitution. Women with hot, moist temperaments needed different techniques than women with cold, dry temperaments. Angle of penetration mattered. Duration mattered. Everything had to be calibrated to produce female seed release. Court records from the 14th century include references to physicians being called in to advise couples who'd been married for years without producing children. The physician would interview both parties separately, then together, conduct physical examinations, then prescribe treatment, which often included detailed instructions on how the husband should approach relations to ensure his wife reached climax. Now here's the contradiction that must have made medieval people's heads spin. Church says pleasure is sinful. You should approach marital relations with duty and restraint. Experiencing too much enjoyment suggests you're controlled by lust. Medicine says pleasure is necessary. Wives can't conceive without climax. Husbands have duty to master techniques for producing female satisfaction. These two authoritative systems, church teaching backed by threat of damnation, medical science backed by university training, were telling married couples completely opposite things. How did people navigate this? Carefully, with cognitive dissonance. In practice, couples could frame pursuit of female pleasure as medical necessity for conception. As long as your stated intention was procreation rather than pleasure for its own sake, techniques that happened to produce enjoyment might be tolerated. Women struggling to conceive had medical authorization to tell their husbands the physician said they needed different approaches. This gave wives socially acceptable way to advocate for their own needs without appearing lustful or demanding. Court records show occasional cases where women sought annulments on grounds that their husbands were incapable of providing stimulation necessary for conception. These women weren't explicitly talking about pleasure. They framed everything in medical language about seed release and procreative function. But the underlying reality was that their intimate lives weren't working, and they had medical backing to say so. Medieval medicine's acknowledgement of female sexual response was significant, even though it was based on completely wrong understanding of anatomy. It created space within rigidly patriarchal society for recognizing that women's bodies had needs and responses that mattered, even if only as means to the end of pregnancy. But not all medieval medical theories about female bodies were so relatively benign. Some were downright bizarre and led to invasive, uncomfortable, sometimes dangerous treatments. Let me tell you about the wandering womb. Medieval physicians believed the uterus could move around inside a woman's body. This wandering womb theory came from ancient Greek medicine, Plato, Hippocratic texts. It remained mainstream medical belief throughout the medieval period. The theory went like this: the uterus was understood as a kind of internal creature with its own needs and desires. If a woman went too long without sexual relations, her uterus would become dry, frustrated, unsatisfied. Seeking moisture and fulfillment, it would begin to wander upward through her body cavity, pressing against her lungs, heart, diaphragm. Medieval doctors blamed wandering womb for an astonishing array of female complaints: anxiety and nervousness, wandering womb pressing on the heart, fainting spells and weakness, womb blocking proper circulation, difficulty breathing, womb pressed against the lungs, heart palpitations, womb too close to the heart, insomnia and restlessness, unsatisfied womb causing systemic imbalance, digestive problems, womb interfering with stomach and intestines, depression and melancholy, humoral imbalance caused by misplaced womb. The prescribed treatment was straightforward: marriage and regular sexual relations. Physicians literally wrote prescriptions for intimacy as medical treatment for single women suffering from these symptoms. For widows who'd been long without husbands, physicians were particularly concerned. These women had been accustomed to regular relations and then suddenly deprived. Their wombs, used to satisfaction, would be especially prone to wandering. Medical texts from the period include case studies of women successfully treated for wandering womb through marriage. Women suffering from fainting spells and breathing difficulties would marry, begin regular relations with husband. Symptoms would resolve. Physicians attributed this to her womb settling back into proper position once it received regular moisture and stimulation. For married women experiencing these symptoms, physicians would question whether their husbands were providing adequate attention. A case from a 14th century France records a physician telling a woman's husband that he needed to increase frequency of relations to settle her womb and restore her vital balance. If marriage wasn't an option for women too young or who'd taken religious vows, physicians had other treatments. Strong-smelling substances, pleasant scents near the woman's genitals to lure the womb back down, foul-smelling materials near her nose to drive it away from her head. Medical texts describe in detail how to perform this treatment. Patient lies on her back, perfumed cloths soaked in rose oil placed between her legs. Meanwhile, physician waves asafoetida, a plant with notoriously foul smell, often called devil's dung, under her nose. Theory was that womb would be attracted to pleasant smell and repelled by foul smell, coaxing it back to proper position. More invasive treatments included internal manipulation by midwives who would physically push the womb back into place. Herbal pessaries inserted internally to anchor the womb and prevent it from wandering again. External poultices made from various herbs applied to lower abdomen to attract womb downward. Some physicians even recommended fumigation, directing herbal smoke into the vaginal canal to encourage womb to descend. These treatments were uncomfortable at best, dangerous at worst, but they were considered legitimate medicine, taught in universities, described in authoritative medical texts, practiced by respected physicians. Medieval medicine also taught that retained seed could poison women from the inside. Just as men released seed through emission, women were thought to produce seed that needed to be expelled through climax. If woman went too long without release, her retained seed would supposedly putrefy inside her body, causing various ailments. Symptoms of retained seed poisoning included fever and chills, skin eruptions and rashes, swelling of abdomen, irritability, and aggressive behavior, physical restlessness preventing sleep. For unmarried women, this created medical dilemma that seemed impossible to resolve. They needed release for health, but sexual activity outside marriage was gravely sinful. How could medicine and morality both be satisfied? The solution some physicians proposed: midwives could provide manual relief for women suffering from retained seed syndrome. Midwife would stimulate the patient to climax, releasing the putrefied seed and restoring health. This was categorized as medical treatment, not sexual activity. Medieval medical texts describe this procedure in clinical Latin, explaining proper technique, signs that indicated successful release had been achieved. Expected improvement in symptoms following treatment. From our perspective, it seems absurd that this was medicine, while consensual activity between unmarried adults was sin. But within medieval logic, where everything had to fit into categories of either medicinal or sinful, licit or illicit, it made perfect sense. Nuns were thought particularly susceptible to both wandering womb and retained seed conditions, since they were vowed to perpetual celibacy. Their bodies still produced seed, still had wombs that could wander, but they had no legitimate outlet. Convents kept midwives on staff specifically to provide these medical interventions when nuns showed concerning symptoms. The fact that these treatments were carefully distinguished from sinful activity shows how medieval people navigated impossible contradictions. Church said all non-procreative sexuality was sin. But bodies have needs that exist whether or not they're being met through approved channels. So medicine created categories and procedures that addressed physical needs, while technically preserving moral boundaries. You couldn't have relations outside marriage. That was sin that would damn your soul. But you could receive medical treatment for conditions caused by lack of relations. That was healing, health, acceptable. The distinction seems absurd to modern eyes, but it created just enough space for addressing real human needs within society that was rigidly moralistic about sexuality. Now, given all these rules, all these contradictions, all these impossible standards, it's perhaps not surprising that some medieval marriages failed. Couples who couldn't make it work, who were fundamentally incompatible, who faced problems they couldn't solve. But here's the thing, divorce as we understand it didn't exist. The Catholic Church taught that marriage was a sacrament. instituted by God, absolutely indissoluble, except by death. Once validly married, you were married forever. The only option was annulment, not ending a marriage, but declaring that a valid marriage had never existed in the first place. Church would grant annulments on specific grounds: being too closely related by blood, one party already being married to someone else, being forced into marriage against your will, or inability to consummate. That last ground created some of the most invasive legal proceedings in medieval history. We already talked about capability examinations, but there's more to the story, because proving a marriage should be annulled required more than just one examination. It required building a legal case, gathering witnesses, providing testimony. Your private life became public trial. Neighbours would testify about suspicious activity they'd observed, about whether they'd heard sounds from your bedchamber, about your husband's comings and goings, about whether you seemed satisfied or frustrated. Your servants would be questioned about household movements, private conversations they'd overheard, stains they'd seen on sheets, your morning routines and evening habits. The entire community had been watching, noticing, accumulating evidence. This reflects how completely absent privacy was in medieval life. Your intimate affairs were everyone's business, because your sexual behaviour affected community morality, local reputation, property arrangements, social stability. Neighbours felt they had not just permission, but obligation to monitor your fidelity and report suspicions. If annulment was granted, economic consequences were severe. Dowry had to be returned, property divided, alliances dissolved. This created strong financial incentives on both sides. Wife seeking annulment wanted freedom to potentially remarry. Husband fighting annulment wanted to keep dowry and avoid public humiliation. Families invested resources in legal proceedings, hired advocates, paid for expert testimony. The economic stakes made invasive examinations inevitable within medieval logic. Marriage wasn't primarily about love or companionship, it was economic contract with enormous financial implications. What strikes me most reading these court records is how the most intimate, vulnerable human experiences became legal evidence. Your body's responses, your capabilities, your most private failures, all documented, witnessed, recorded in permanent archives that would outlive you by centuries. Medieval people accepted this because they had no concept of intimate privacy as a right. Your body, your marriage, your ability to fulfill marital duties, these affected families, inheritances, property arrangements, social order. Of course, they were subject to legal scrutiny and public examination. How could something so important, something with such far-reaching consequences, possibly be left purely private between two people? But there's one more aspect of medieval sexuality we haven't touched yet, one that reveals just how desperate women were to have some control over their own bodies, even if that control might kill them. The average medieval woman who survived childhood faced 8 to 12 pregnancies. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for young women. Women knew this. They watched sisters, cousins, neighbours die in childbirth. They understood that another pregnancy might kill them. But the church absolutely forbade contraception. Any intentional attempt to prevent conception was considered mortal sin, essentially equivalent to murder because it prevented a potential soul from coming into existence. This left women in an impossible position. Another pregnancy might kill them, but preventing pregnancy could damn their souls to eternal hell. Historical evidence shows that despite church prohibition and real danger of severe punishment, contraceptive knowledge circulated through underground networks of women. Midwives were the primary keepers and transmitters of this forbidden knowledge. They passed it orally in whispered conversations, mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice, woman to woman in spaces where men weren't present. Some methods were relatively harmless, even if they didn't work particularly well. Prolonged breastfeeding does suppress fertility to some degree, though not reliably enough to prevent pregnancy consistently. Women who could afford wet nurses often had closer spaced pregnancies than women who nursed their own children. Medieval people noticed this even if they didn't understand the hormonal mechanisms involved. Timing methods based on menstrual cycles seemed logical, but medieval understanding of female fertility was completely backward. Physicians believed women were most fertile during and immediately after menstruation, which is essentially the opposite of biological reality. So couples trying to avoid conception by abstaining during what they thought were fertile days were actually abstaining during the safest times and engaging during peak fertility. Amulets and charms worn during relations were pure superstition with no physical effect. Some women wore specific stones or herbs in pouches around their necks or waists, believing these would prevent conception. The only real benefit was that believing you had protection might reduce the anxiety that made pregnancy feel like a constant looming threat. Then there were herbal preparations, and this is where desperation met genuine danger. Medieval women used plants that modern pharmacology has confirmed do have contraceptive or abortifacient properties, but without standardized dosing, without understanding of active compounds, without any quality control, using these herbs was extraordinarily risky. Pennyroyal is a mint family plant that contains pelargonium, a compound that can prevent implantation of a fertilized egg or cause uterine contractions, leading to miscarriage. Medieval women brewed it into tea or chewed the fresh leaves. The problem: the effective dose sits dangerously close to the toxic dose. Pennyroyal in sufficient quantity to reliably prevent pregnancy also causes severe liver damage. Women were essentially poisoning themselves incrementally, gambling that they'd hit the narrow therapeutic window between ineffective and fatal. Rue contains compounds that cause uterine contractions and can interfere with implantation. It was widely cultivated across medieval Europe, growing in kitchen gardens and wild along roadsides. Women would brew rue leaves into bitter tea or chew them directly. Side effects ranged from painful skin reactions when handling the plant to severe digestive distress when consuming it. High doses caused kidney damage that progressed silently until it was too late to reverse. Queen Anne's lace, wild carrot seeds, actually does contain compounds that interfere with progesterone synthesis and can prevent implantation. Medieval herbals recommended chewing 7 seeds daily, starting immediately after relations. This was one of the few historical contraceptive methods that was both relatively safe and somewhat effective. Though medieval women had no idea why it worked or that they'd stumbled onto something with genuine pharmacological activity, archaeological evidence strongly supports how common these practices were. Analysis of organic residues from medieval cesspits and latrines has revealed seeds and plant materials from known contraceptive herbs in concentrations far higher than would occur from normal dietary use. This suggests women were consuming these plants regularly and systematically, not just occasionally experimenting. But here's what makes this truly tragic. Without standardized preparation methods, one woman might brew pennyroyal tea too weak to have any contraceptive effect. Another might make it strong enough to cause liver failure. There was no way to know in advance whether you'd mixed it right. You only found out afterward, either by getting pregnant anyway or by becoming violently ill. Some women experimented with barrier methods. Sea sponges soaked in vinegar or lemon juice. Acids do have some spermicidal properties, so this approach wasn't entirely without scientific basis. Wool or linen soaked in various substances and inserted before relations. Mixtures of beeswax and plant gums shaped into insertable barriers that would theoretically block or absorb. These concepts came from ancient medical texts, Greek and Egyptian sources that had been translated into Latin. The basic principle was sound. Physical barriers can be effective, But medieval people had no understanding of infection, no concept of sterility, no awareness that introducing non-sterile materials into the body could cause life-threatening problems. Women were inserting these barriers using unwashed hands, with materials that hadn't been cleaned properly, into bodies that would be traumatized by penetration during use. Infections were common. Some women developed serious internal infections from barriers that broke apart and couldn't be fully removed, leading to sepsis that killed them more surely than any pregnancy would have. Then there were methods so dangerous they reveal absolute desperation. Some medieval texts mention mercury applications, rubbing mercury-containing ointments on the lower abdomen or taking small amounts internally. The theory was that mercury would cool the reproductive organs and prevent conception. The reality was mercury poisoning, progressing through tremors and tooth loss toward madness and death. Lead-based solutions appeared in some physicians' prescriptions. Women would drink mixtures containing lead acetate, called sugar of lead, because of its sweet taste, believing it would prevent pregnancy. What it actually did was cause lead poisoning, severe abdominal pain, constipation, anemia, eventually brain damage in those who survived long enough. Copper sulfate applications were recommended in some Arab medical texts that had been translated into Latin. Women would use copper sulfate solutions as internal washes after relations. While copper ions do have some contraceptive properties, the concentrations used in medieval preparations caused severe chemical burns to delicate internal tissues. Medical case descriptions from the period mention women suffering permanent scarring and chronic infection from these treatments. Skeletal analysis of medieval cemetery remains has revealed something disturbing. Some young women's bones show elevated levels of heavy metals, mercury, lead, copper, at concentrations that indicate chronic exposure rather than one-time accidents. These women most likely died from the contraceptives they were using, not from the pregnancies they were trying to prevent. The Church's absolute prohibition made everything worse. Women couldn't seek open medical advice about preventing pregnancy, since doing so was admitting intent to commit mortal sin. They couldn't consult physicians honestly. They couldn't get reliable information or proper guidance, so they relied on underground networks, on knowledge passed woman to woman, on substances whose dangers they didn't fully understand. If a woman became seriously ill from contraceptive use, she faced a cruel choice: seek medical help and confess what she'd done, risking spiritual punishment, public penance, possibly legal consequences, or suffer in silence and possibly die. Many chose silence. Their deaths were attributed to mysterious female ailments, womb problems, divine punishments, anything except the truth that they'd poisoned themselves trying to control their own fertility. Some women did confess on their deathbeds when they thought they were dying anyway and wanted to receive last rites. These deathbed confessions, recorded by priests, occasionally mention women admitting to using herbs, potions, or other methods to prevent pregnancy. When these confessions were written down in enough detail, they became some of our only direct evidence for practices that were otherwise completely hidden from historical record. The shadow market for contraceptive materials operated across all of medieval Europe. Wise women and herbalists sold preparations, though they had to be extremely careful about advertising. A tea for women's health might actually be pennyroyal for contraception. A tonic to encourage monthly flow might be rue to induce early miscarriage. These euphemisms allowed trade to continue while maintaining plausible deniability if authorities came asking questions. Women who developed reputations for knowing these herbs could make substantial income. But they also walked a dangerous line. If too many customers got sick, or if anyone reported them to church authorities, they risked prosecution as witches. The accusation was that they were interfering with God's will to create life. which suggested demonic assistance. Multiple witch trial records mention women being accused specifically because they provided contraceptive or abortifacient substances to other women. The most tragic cases involved young women who found themselves pregnant and desperate, servants who'd been forced by masters, peasant girls seduced and abandoned. These women had even less access to safe methods than married women did. They tried whatever they could find, drinking toxic teas, inserting sharp objects, inflicting physical trauma on themselves, often with fatal results. Court records occasionally document these deaths, though usually without much detail. A young woman found dead with evidence of toxic plant consumption. A servant who hemorrhaged after attempting to end a pregnancy using physical methods. A girl who developed fatal infection from inserting foreign objects. The records note the deaths, but rarely acknowledge the desperation that drove these women to such dangerous measures. The inequality is stark when you consider that men had a simple, safe contraceptive option available. Withdrawal. It required no substances, no devices, no risk to health. The church condemned it as sinful seed wasting, but it didn't involve consuming poison or risking infection. Yet many medieval men simply refused to practice withdrawal, considering it their right to complete inside their wives, regardless of circumstances. This forced all the contraceptive burden onto women, who had to choose between dangerous methods that could kill them, or endless pregnancies that would almost certainly kill them eventually. Medieval writings suggest withdrawal was seen as emasculating, as denying men their natural completion, as wives trying to control something that should be entirely under male authority. So women faced not only the physical burden of dangerous contraception, but also the social burden of having no acceptable way to ask their husbands for cooperation in the one method that was relatively safe. And if controlling conception was desperate and dangerous, there was one more area where medieval people sought forbidden power over their own lives. Love magic. In a world where most marriages were arranged based on economic and political considerations, where love was considered a pleasant bonus but never a requirement for marriage, some people yearned for something different. They wanted to marry someone they'd chosen, someone they felt drawn to, someone who wasn't just assigned to them through family negotiations. This yearning created demand for love magic. Charms, potions, rituals designed to make someone fall in love with you or to strengthen existing affection that faced family opposition. Love magic was one of the most common forms of spellcasting across medieval Europe. The grimoires, books of magical procedures that survive in monastery and university libraries, devote enormous space to love spells. This tells us that people were desperately interested in influencing romantic outcomes, far more than they were interested in most other types of magic. Not all love magic was dark or disturbing. Many love charms were relatively innocent, carrying certain flowers or herbs associated with love and attraction, wearing specific colours on days associated with Venus, reciting prayers to Saint Valentine or other saints believed to help with romantic matters, creating intricate knots that symbolically bound two people together. These practices shaded into normal courtship behaviour and weren't particularly controversial, but some love magic crossed into territory that reveals deep desperation and willingness to do disturbing things for the chance at choosing your own partner. One of the most common forms involved bodily fluids. The logic was sympathetic magic. If part of your body entered another person's body, you could create a link, an influence over them. Church court records from across Europe document prosecutions for this type of love magic. In 1320, a woman named Beatrice appeared before a French church court, accused of feeding her menstrual blood to a man she hoped to marry. She hadn't acted in secret or on impulse. She'd consulted with a local wise woman who gave her detailed instructions. Collect menstrual blood on the first day of your cycle. Mix it with red wine to disguise both colour and taste. Serve it to the man while speaking specific words over the cup. Feed him this mixture on 3 consecutive nights during the new moon phase. Beatrice followed these instructions exactly. According to trial testimony, the man did become more attentive and affectionate toward her after consuming the doctored wine. But someone, possibly a rival or possibly his family, reported her to church authorities. She was tried, convicted of practicing forbidden magic, sentenced to public penance that included walking through town in penitential garments while priests announced her sin, followed by pilgrimage to a distant shrine. Her testimony during trial, preserved in church archives, reveals her motivation. She explained that her family wanted to marry her to an older merchant she found repulsive. She'd fallen in love with a young craftsman, but her family wouldn't consider him because his economic prospects were inferior. Love magic seemed like her only chance to influence her own fate, to end up with someone she'd chosen rather than someone chosen for her. Cases like Beatrice's appear throughout medieval court records. Women, and occasionally men, though women were prosecuted far more frequently, using bodily fluids in food or drink to try to influence affection. Sometimes it was menstrual blood, sometimes it was other secretions. The specific substance varied, but the underlying logic remained the same: creating physical connection to enable emotional or magical influence. Other love magic required stranger ingredients. Medieval grimoires list recipes that sound like something from nightmares. Hair collected from the beloved while they slept, ideally without their knowledge. Nail clippings taken from the person you desired, ground into powder. Pieces of clothing the person had worn next to their skin, particularly undergarments that had absorbed their sweat. Some recipes called for graveyard dirt collected at midnight during specific moon phases. The idea was that places associated with death held particular power that could be redirected toward compelling life and love. Women would sneak into churchyards after dark, digging up small amounts of earth from graves while reciting incantations they'd memorized from wise women or from grimoires they'd somehow gained access to. The most disturbing recipes called for materials from corpses themselves. Some grimoires claimed that carrying a finger bone from a dead person would make you irresistible to the living. Others recommended heart tissue from corpses, preferably from people who died young or violently, ground into powder and mixed into food or drink meant for the target of your affection. Whether many people actually followed these most extreme instructions is unclear, but the fact that such texts circulated, were copied in monastery scriptoriums, were preserved in libraries, suggests they were taken seriously by at least some portion of the population. The Church condemned all love magic as trafficking with demons. The theological reasoning was straightforward. Any magic that actually produced real effects had to be powered by supernatural forces. God and angels wouldn't help you manipulate someone's free will, which meant any love magic that genuinely worked must involve demonic assistance. This made practicing love magic not just a sin but potential heresy, association with evil forces, proof of having rejected God in favour of demons. Penalties ranged from a public penance for first offences to execution for repeated practice or particularly egregious cases. Yet people continued to seek out and use love magic, which tells us how desperate they were to have some influence over their own romantic and marital destinies. In a world where your family would sell you into arranged marriage with strangers, where economic considerations trumped any personal feelings, where running away meant social death and likely starvation, love magic offered at least the illusion of agency. The gender dynamics of love magic prosecution are particularly revealing. While both men and women practice love magic, court records show roughly 4 women prosecuted for every 1 man. This disparity reflects both the limited options women had for influencing their own fates and the medieval anxiety about female sexuality and power. A woman using magic to make a man fall in love with her was inverting the natural order in medieval thinking. She was making herself the active party, the one with power, exerting control over a man. This threatened fundamental assumptions about male authority and female submission that undergirded medieval social structure. Male love magic was often treated more leniently, seen as misguided but understandable male desire rather than dangerous female manipulation. A man using love magic was still sinning, but he wasn't challenging the gender hierarchy in the same threatening way. The line between love magic and legitimate religious practice was often blurry in ways that confused medieval people themselves. The church approved of praying to Saint Valentine for help finding a spouse. Pilgrims visited shrines associated with marriage and fertility, making offerings and asking for divine intervention in romantic matters. How different was praying to Saint Valentine from reciting a love charm? Both involved speaking specific words with intention of influencing romantic outcomes. Both assumed that supernatural forces could be petitioned or influenced. Both aimed to achieve worldly goals through spiritual means. The Church's answer was that prayer submitted humbly to God's will, while magic tried to compel supernatural forces to do your bidding. Prayer was asking for God's blessing on whatever God chose to give you. Magic was demanding specific outcomes according to your own desires. But in actual practice, medieval people's prayers and their magical charms often looked remarkably similar. Both involved ritual words and actions. Both called on supernatural powers. Both tried to achieve specific, concrete goals. The distinction the Church drew seemed more theological than practical. The deeper reality is that medieval people were navigating a world where they had frighteningly little control over their own lives. Marriage determined your entire future, your economic situation, your social status, where you'd live, who you'd spend every day with, until death. It affected not just you, but your children, your extended family, your entire lineage. Having absolutely no say in such a life-determining decision felt unbearable. Love magic offered hope, perhaps false hope, perhaps dangerous hope, but hope nonetheless that you might influence your own destiny rather than being entirely subject to forces beyond your control. When we look at medieval people trying to brew love potions or collecting graveyard dirt at midnight, it's easy to mock them for believing in magic that couldn't possibly work. But we should remember what they were up against. Families that would force them into marriages with strangers for economic benefit. Churches that taught that once married you were bound forever, regardless of compatibility or happiness. Social structures that offered no legitimate way to choose your own partner based on affection. In that context, risking church punishment to try some magical ritual doesn't seem irrational. It seems like a desperate grasp at agency in a system designed to deny you any. And there's one final aspect of medieval sexuality we need to address. One that shows how even within marriage, even after surviving all the rest, your intimate betrayals could become public spectacle. Despite all the church teachings emphasizing the sanctity and permanence of marriage, despite legal and social structures designed to hold marriages together, despite the complete lack of legitimate divorce, adultery happened in medieval society just as it happens in any human society. Medieval law treated adultery as both a sin against God and a crime against social order. It threatened legitimate inheritance by potentially introducing children of uncertain paternity into family lines. It undermined the property arrangements and alliances that marriages were designed to secure. It challenged the fundamental social institution that held medieval society together. Punishments varied widely across regions and time periods, but they shared common features. They were public, designed to humiliate, and they revealed stark gender inequalities in how male and female adultery were treated. In England, convicted adulterers might be sentenced to public penance. This involved walking through town on market day, when crowds were largest, wearing only a white sheet or shift. Barefoot, carrying a candle, a priest would walk ahead announcing the sin to everyone they passed. The penitent would have to make this walk every Sunday for weeks or months, ensuring that everyone in the community witnessed their shame. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was public humiliation that would deter others from similar sins and allow the sinner to reintegrate into the community through acknowledged repentance. But the cost to reputation was severe. Everyone in town would see you, know your sin, judge your character. Your children would watch their parent paraded as an adulterer. Business associates would reconsider dealings with someone of demonstrated poor moral character. Your social standing would collapse. In some French and Italian cities, adulterers faced more severe physical punishments. Public whipping in the town square while crowds gathered to watch. Branding with hot irons, sometimes on the cheek or forehead, ensuring permanent visible marking that would follow the person forever. Head shaving, particularly for women, since long hair was a mark of femininity, respectability, and virtue. Some cities practiced forced marches where the guilty pair would be stripped of most clothing and forced to run through prescribed routes, while townspeople lined up to strike them with switches or throw garbage and waste at them. The gender disparity in punishment reveals medieval double standards starkly. A man caught in adultery might face fines, mild penance, or in many cases no punishment at all, especially if he was wealthy or socially prominent. Male adultery, while technically sinful, was often treated as natural male weakness, evidence of robust virility, proof that his wife wasn't satisfying him adequately. A woman caught in adultery faced severe punishment. Whipping, branding, head shaving, banishment, or worse. Female adultery was treated as far more serious because it threatened paternity certainty. A man's adultery didn't introduce questions about whether his wife's children were actually his. A woman's adultery meant any resulting children might not be her husband's, which threatened inheritance, bloodlines, family identity. Some medieval legal codes explicitly allowed a husband who caught his wife in adultery to kill both her and her lover without facing murder charges, but only if he killed them immediately upon discovery in the heat of passion. This crime of passion defense had roots in ancient Roman law and persisted in some jurisdictions into shockingly recent times. Women had no equivalent right. A wife discovering her husband's adultery could seek help from church courts, but she had no legal authorization for immediate violence. The law assumed male authority extended even to punishing female sexual transgressions with death. Community involvement in adultery punishment was intense. Your neighbours would testify about suspicious comings and goings they'd observed. Your servants would be questioned about household movements and private conversations they'd overheard. The entire town had been watching, noticing, accumulating evidence. This reflects how completely absent privacy was in medieval life. Your intimate affairs were everyone's business because your sexual behaviour affected community morality, local reputation, property arrangements, social stability. Neighbours felt they had not just permission, but obligation to monitor your fidelity and report suspicions. Some documented punishments are particularly vivid in court records. In 1347, ecclesiastical records from Carcassonne describe a merchant's wife caught with a young clerk. She was sentenced to public flogging through the main streets, her hair shorn completely, then permanent banishment from the city. She survived the physical punishment but disappeared from all records after leaving town, becoming one of countless medieval women erased from history after such shaming. The clerk involved received a fine and minor penance. His career continued. His name appears in later city records conducting normal business. Her life, as she knew it, ended completely. For peasants and townspeople without wealth or influence, adultery became public entertainment, moral instruction, community bonding through shared judgment of transgressors. Their intimate failures became spectacles that the entire town would witness and discuss for years afterward. The wealthy and powerful often escaped the worst consequences. Noble adultery was whispered about but rarely punished unless it created serious political problems. Kings kept mistresses openly. Noble lords had affairs that everyone knew about, but no one officially acknowledged. Power protected people from consequences that would destroy commoners. So where are you right now, listening to this? It's late, isn't it? Maybe you're in bed, maybe curled up on the couch with the lights dim, and you can choose to be there. You chose who you're with, or chose to be alone. You chose whether to marry, when to marry, who to marry. You chose whether to have children, and how many, and when. Every single one of those choices would have been impossible for most people throughout medieval history. Think about that for a moment. The freedom to choose your own partner based on love rather than family arrangement. The ability to control your fertility without risking death from toxic herbs or dangerous procedures. The right to keep your intimate life private between you and your partner without witnesses, church officials, or community oversight. Medical care that respects confidentiality. Legal protections that recognize your autonomy over your own body. These aren't ancient rights humans have always enjoyed. They're modern developments, many of them achieved only in the last century or two, some of them achieved only in your lifetime. Medieval people weren't fundamentally different from us. They felt love, desire, fear, joy just as intensely as we do. They wanted connection, partnership, autonomy over their own lives. They were human beings navigating human experiences with human emotions, but they did it in a world without privacy, where individual desires were always subordinate to family obligations, community standards, religious doctrine, economic necessity, where your body wasn't truly yours, where your marriage wasn't private, where your most intimate moments were subject to scrutiny by people who claimed authority over aspects of your life that we now consider deeply personal. They found ways to love each other despite arranged marriages. They formed deep partnerships despite lack of choice. They protected each other despite invasive oversight. Human connection persisted even when systems tried to reduce it to property exchange and procreation duty. Understanding how recently we gained these freedoms helps us appreciate and protect them. Privacy in intimate matters isn't natural or inevitable. It was fought for, argued for, slowly developed over centuries against resistance at every step. So tonight, as you fall asleep in your private space, perhaps with a partner you chose freely, with your intimate decisions subject only to your own judgment, with medical care that respects confidentiality and legal protections that recognize your autonomy, feel grateful. Grateful for the slow work of centuries that gave you freedoms medieval people couldn't imagine. Grateful for medical advances that made intimacy safer. Grateful for social changes that recognized marriage should be based on mutual choice rather than family arrangement. Grateful for the simple fact that your private life is genuinely private, that nobody's organizing witnesses for your bedroom, that you won't face examination by church courts or community tribunals. Sleep well, knowing your private life belongs to you. It's a gift from history, hard-won and precious. If you enjoyed this journey through medieval marriage and the gradual development of privacy, subscribe for more stories about the brutal, beautiful, complicated truth of human history. Like this video if you're grateful for modern freedoms we often take for granted. And let me know in the comments, what shocked you most tonight? The witnessed wedding nights, the church bedroom rules, the capability examinations, the women poisoning themselves with contraceptives? I want to know what hit you hardest. Until next time, rest easy, knowing that however complicated modern relationships might be, at least they happen in private, between people who chose each other, without church officials taking notes. Sweet dreams, everyone.